I want to tell you about a door that does not exist anymore. It was in the basement of a Vanderbilt mansion, spring of 1912. A stonemason stood in front of it with a trowel in his hand, and a man in a good coat standing behind him, and the man in the good coat told him to fill it in. Brick it up. Lay the courses tight, and finish the mortar clean, so that nobody would ever know there had been an opening there at all. The mason's name was Patrick Develin. He was 37 years old. He had hands like split leather, and he had built half the cellars on the east side, and he had never in his life been afraid of a hole in the ground until that morning, because the door did not lead into the mansion, it led under it, and on the other side of it, below the floor, the Vanderbilts walked on. Below the cellar, the servants worked in. There was a room with windows, stone windows, set into a wall of dressed granite that was older than the house, older than the street, older than anything that family had built. The windows looked out at nothing, at packed earth, at the dark. Devlin stood there and he counted the courses he would need. And then he did what he was told. He bricked it up. He sealed the lower floor. And 40 years later, dying, he wrote his son a letter about it, because he could not carry it into the ground with him. The letter was found in 1995 in a tin box behind the lath of a house in Queens. This is what it said. I am not going to ask you to believe anything tonight. I am going to ask you to look. Because what I have found, what Develin's letter records, what the city engineers of 3 different cities wrote down in their own ledgers, what is sitting right now under the streets you can walk on this afternoon. It does not require your belief. It happened, it is documented, it is paved over, and almost nobody talks about it. If you have ever stood in an old building and felt that the floor you were standing on was not the first floor, that there was something below the bottom, you were not imagining it. In a great many cities, the ground itself is a lie. The street is not where it started. The first story is buried. I am going to show you the record, all of it. But before I do, if you want to keep finding the things they paved over, subscribe. That is the whole arrangement. They bury it, we dig it up, and the only way I can keep digging is if you are standing here with me when I do. So subscribe. Then come down into the cellar with me. We are going to be down there a while. Let me tell you how the letter came to me. It did not come the way these things are supposed to come. There was no archive, no museum, no scholar handing me a folder across a reading room table. There was a man in Queens tearing out a wall. The house was being gutted. The plaster was a century old, and it came off the lath in great gray sheets, and behind the lath, wedged between 2 studs, where someone had pushed it and then sealed it in, there was a flat tin box, the kind that once held loose tobacco. Inside the box were 3 things: a set of mason's calipers worn bright at the joint, a photograph of a man and a boy that nobody could name, and a letter, 11 pages, written in a careful hand that pressed so hard in places it cut the paper. The letter was dated 1952. The man writing it was dying. He says so on the first page, plainly, the way working men say hard things. The doctor tells me I have until the cold comes, and I believe him. And he says he is writing because there is one thing he did with his hands that he cannot stand to take with him, and the boy in the photograph, his son, is the only one he will trust with it. The son never opened the wall. We do not know if the son ever read it, or hid it, or whether someone else hid it from the son. We know only that it sat behind the lath for 43 years, until a renovation crew in 1995 brought it back into the light. I have held that letter. The paper is brittle at the folds. The ink is iron gall, the old kind, that bites into the page. And the hand is the hand of a man who did not write often, and meant every word, because every word cost him. Develin's letter records a specific job, on a specific house in the spring of a specific year. It records what he was hired to do, and what he found while doing it. and what he was ordered to do about what he found, and it records the thing that he could never afterward explain. That is the doorway. That is where we go in, not through theory, through the testimony of a man who was there with a trowel in his hand, who had no reason to lie, who gained nothing by writing it, who in fact lost the last clean sleep of his life to it. Stonemason, follow him down. You have to understand who Patrick Develin was, because everything in his account turns on what kind of man he was. He was born in 1875. He told his son the year the way men of that generation did, tying it to a thing that mattered more than the date. I was born the year before the centennial, the summer my mother lost the farm. He came up out of the kind of poverty that does not photograph well, the kind that lives in a one-room flat with a window onto an air shaft. His father laid brick. His father's father had laid stone in the old country in the west of Ireland, walls that are still standing in fields where nobody lives anymore. So Patrick laid brick too. There was no choosing. He started at 12, carrying hod, a wooden frame loaded with bricks balanced on the shoulder, up a ladder, all day, for a man who would dock his pay if a single brick chipped. By 15, he could lay a course. By 20, he was a journeyman, and by 30, he was the man the contractors called when the work was hard, and the client was rich, and the margin for error was nothing. He writes about his hands. There is a passage in the letter where he describes his own hands to his son, and I think he does it because he wants the boy to remember the hands and not the man, the way you remember a tool. My hands are not good for much now, Teehee writes. They have laid more brick than I could count if I lived twice. The mortar got into them long ago. You will remember they were rough. They were always rough. A mason's hands are how he prays, that is, the man, humble, precise, proud of exactly one thing, which was that the work was true, that a wall he built stood plumb and square and did not move, that he had never in his life laid a course he was ashamed of, which is why the thing eats him alive, because the one wall in his whole life he was ashamed of, the one course he laid that he prayed against laying, he laid it perfectly. He bricked up that doorway better than he had ever bricked anything, tight and clean and forever, exactly the way a man does work he wishes he could refuse, pouring all the shame into the craft. And it stood. It is probably standing now. He was on the crew because of his hands. That is the plain reason. The Vanderbilt renovation needed masons who could match old work, who could lay new stone against old stone so that the seam disappeared, and there were perhaps a dozen men in the city who could do it, and Develin was one of them. The contractor vouched for him. He was told it was prestige work. The pay was good. Better than good, he writes. More than I had ever been offered, which should have told me something. He was glad of the money. He had a son to raise. He took the job the way a poor man takes a good job, with gratitude and no questions. He should have asked the questions. Now I am going to give you what he saw. I am going to give it to you the way he wrote it, in the order he found it, because the order matters. He did not walk in knowing. He found out the way you find out anything terrible. One piece at a time, each piece reasonable, until you are stand somewhere you cannot explain how you got to. The job as it was described to him was straightforward. The mansion had a problem with damp in the lower cellar. The family wanted the cellar excavated deeper and re-walled, a new floor poured, the whole sublevel made sound and dry. Devlin and 4 other men were brought down to do the stonework. They dug, and here is the first thing. Devlin writes that the ground they were digging into was not natural ground. It was filth, he says, made ground. Rubble and ash and broken brick, the kind you put down to raise a low place. We have all dug it. But there was too much of it, and it went too deep, and it was too old. They went down past where the cellar floor should have bottomed out, and the fill kept going, 6 feet, 8. The other men started to mutter. because you do not expect to dig that far down through made ground in a house that was supposedly built on solid Manhattan schist. And then Develin's pick hit stone, not a stone, stone. Worked stone, dressed and squared, the top of a wall, running level in both directions as far as they cleared it. He writes that he knew the instant the pick rang what it was, the way a mason knows, because dressed stone rings different from rubble. It rang like a church floor. He says. They cleared along the top of it, and the wall went down. Below the cellar, they had been told, was the bottom of the house. There was another wall, older, better built, and as they followed it down and along, Develin found the windows. He spends a long time on the windows, and I am going to spend it with him, because this is the center of the whole letter, and I do not want to rush past it. They were stone windows, not frames for glass, openings, arched at the top with a true voussoired arch, the wedge-shaped stones locked around a keystone, the kind of arch that takes a master to cut, and that does not fall down for 1,000 years. They were set into the older wall at regular intervals, the way windows are set into any wall that means to look out at a street. But there was no street, there was no out. On the far side of every window was packed earth, the made ground, the fill. The windows looked into the dirt. Develin understood what he was looking at, and he writes it plainly, and it is the sentence that I think cost him the most to set down. These windows were made to look out on the open air, and then the air was taken away from them. The ground was raised up over them, while the house above still stood. Somebody buried a building that was already built, and put a new house on top of it, and never said a word. A floor, a whole lower floor of dressed stone, with windows that had once been above ground, now 8 feet under the cellar of a mansion that the Vanderbilts believed they had built on bare rock. The other masons wanted to keep digging. Of course they did. So did Develin. He was a mason, and you do not find a wall like that and walk away from it. They cleared one window fully, down to the sill, and Develin put his lamp through the opening into the room beyond. He does not describe the room in detail. I think he could not. He gives one line, and then he stops, and the next paragraph begins in a different place, the way a man flinches off a thing he cannot look at. The one line is this: there was a floor in there, swept clean, and there had been no one to sweep it for a long time, that is all. A swept floor, below the buried windows, below the cellar, below the mansion, clean, as though whoever had lived in the lower world had left it tidy and pulled the daylight down behind them. The next morning the man in the good coat came. Develin does not name him. He calls him the family's man, and from the description, the coat, the way the contractor went silent and small in front of him, the soft voice that did not need to be raised. It was someone who spoke for the Vanderbilts and was obeyed without argument. He came down into the dig. He looked at the wall and the windows for a long time and said nothing. Then he turned to Develin, because Develin was the best of the masons, and he gave the order: brick it up, all of it. Fill the windows, course by course, match the old stone so the fill would not show, and then build the new cellar floor over the top exactly as planned, as though nothing were underneath it. The other men were paid off and sent away that same hour. So there would be fewer of us, to Develin writes. He alone was kept to do the bricking, because his work would not show a seam. He asked one question. He writes that he asked it, and he writes that he is ashamed he only asked once. He asked what the lower floor was, and the family's man told him. He said, "It is nothing. It was here before us. We do not discuss what was here before us." And then he said the line that Develin carried for 40 years, the line he set in the middle of the letter like a keystone, the line I am going to leave you with at the end of this part, because it is where his account ends and the long silence begins. You were not hired to find a door, Mr. Develin. You were hired to close one. So Develin closed it. He worked 4 days alone in that cellar. He writes that he laid the courses slow, slower than he needed to, because slowness was the only protest left to a man who had already taken the money and could not give it back. He filled the windows one by one, he matched the old stone. When the family's man came down to inspect, he could not find the seam, and he was pleased, and he paid Devlin the rest of the money, and a sum on top of it that Devlin understood even then was not a bonus. It was a price, the price of a closed mouth. Devlin took it. He had a son, but he kept one thing. This is the physical anchor, and I want to be precise about it because the whole account rests here. Devlin did not keep a photograph. There were none allowed. The family's man had seen to that. He did not keep a stone. What he kept was a drawing. On the back of a delivery slip for mortar lime, in carpenter's pencil, he drew what he had seen before he sealed it: the wall, the spacing of the windows, the profile of the arch, the exact curve of it, the count of the voussoirs, the keystone. A mason can draw an arch from memory the way you can draw your own front door, because he reads arches all day, and Devlin drew this one true. That drawing was folded inside the 1952 letter. It survived. It is the one piece of the buried floor that came back up into the daylight. And here is why it matters. Why a man's pencil sketch on the back of a lime slip is worth more than 1,000 words of theory. The arch Devlin drew is a segmental relieving arch of a specific old proportion, a span to rise ratio, a voussoir count. That does not match the architecture of the mansion above it. The mansion was Gilded Age, Renaissance revival, Beaux-Arts cut stone, the work of the great society architects, all of it documented, all of it dated. The arch in Devlin's drawing is older work, plainer and stronger, the kind of structural arch a builder cuts when he is building to carry a real load and last, not to impress a guest. In other words, the thing he drew does not belong to the house he found it under. It belongs to whatever was there first. The architecture predates the family. Devlin's letter records it, his drawing preserves it, and the proportion of that arch, which Mason could not have invented because he was a layer of brick and not a designer of buildings, is the single hardest piece of evidence in the whole account. He could lie about a swept floor. He could exaggerate windows. A frightened man might, but he could not have drawn from imagination a structurally correct relieving arch in an old proportion he had no training to know, on the back of a lime slip in carpenter's pencil, and then folded it away for 40 years and told no one. He drew what he saw. As for the crew, the 4 men paid off and sent away, Devlin tried years later to find them. He writes about it. One had gone back to Italy. One had died on another job, a fall, which Devlin notes without accusing anyone of anything, and which sits on the page heavier for not being accused. 2 he simply could not find. The contractor who hired them was out of business within 2 years, and the contractor himself, when Devlin once worked up the courage to mention the cellar to him over a beer, looked at me. Devlin writes, like I had said something in a church, and put down his glass and left, and we never spoke again. 5 men went down into that cellar. Only one of them ever wrote it down now. I told you I was not going to ask you to believe anything, so let me leave Devlin where he stands, holding his lamp, and let me show you the part of this that does not depend on him at all. The part you can verify yourself this week, with no letter and no tin box and no faith required. Because the thing in Devlin's account that should be impossible, a building buried under another building, windows from a lower floor sealed below the street, is not impossible. It is documented in real cities, by name with dates. Let me give you the Vanderbilt world first, the real one, so you know I am not inventing the family or the era. The Vanderbilts built like emperors. On Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, they put up what people called the Triple Palace, finished in 1882 at 645th, a single block of mansion so large it housed William Henry Vanderbilt in one part and 2 of his married daughters in the others. 58 rooms in his portion alone, a 3-story art gallery under a skylight, 600 workmen, and 60 European sculptors to build it. That is real. You can look it up. And here is the part nobody dwells on. That palace, that monument was torn down. The north half came down in 1927, the south half in 1947, and high rises went up over the ground, demolished inside a single lifetime, gone. In Newport they built the Breakers, finished in 1895, 70 rooms, 5 floors, designed by Richard Morris Hunt for Cornelius Vanderbilt II, on the foundation of an earlier mansion that had burned. And the Breakers, this is documented, this is in the official history, was built with its boiler buried in an underground space below the front lawn, away from the house, with a network of subterranean systems that visitors never see. A whole engineered underworld beneath the marble floors, deliberately hidden, deliberately sealed off from the guests above. So the idea of a Vanderbilt house with a sealed sublevel is not folklore, it is how they built. The question Develin's letter asks is only this: what if one of those sublevels was not built by the Vanderbilts at all? What if they dug down to lay their own underworld and found someone else's already there? And now the cities. Because here is the thing they do not teach you, and it is not a theory, it is in the engineering records of the United States. Cities used to raise themselves out of the ground. They lifted their own streets, sometimes by a full story or more, and when they did it, the old ground floors, the floors that had been at street level, became basements, became sublevels, became sealed rooms with windows that looked out into packed fill. Exactly what Develin found. Take Chicago. In the 1850s and 1860s, the engineers of Chicago raised the grade of the entire central city because the town sat so low on the lake that it could not drain, and cholera was killing 1 in 16 people. So they lifted it. Under the plan of the engineer Ellis Chesbrough, adopted in 1856, they raised the streets and they raised the buildings to meet them. In January 1858, they jacked up a 4-story brick building weighing 750 tons on 200 jack screws and lifted it more than 6 feet without cracking a wall. In 1860, a consortium of engineers, one of them a young man named George Pullman, raised half a city block on Lake Street in a single operation, hotel and all, with the guests still inside. Half a city block, lifted out of the mud, by hand. And where a building was not lifted, the street simply rose around it, and its first floor became its cellar, and the windows that had opened on the sidewalk now opened on 6 feet of fill. There are buildings in old Chicago whose original ground floor is underground right now, sealed because the city climbed up over them. I am not telling you a legend. I am telling you the published record of American civil engineering. I will refuse the easy story once here, so you know I am being honest with you. I am not telling you Chicago raised itself to hide a lost civilization. Chicago raised itself to stop dying of cholera, and it is one of the great engineering feats of the century, and the men who did it wrote it all down with pride. That is true, hold that, and hold this at the same time. The result of it, the physical fact left behind, is the layer of buried ground floors under a modern city. Both things are true. The reason was sanitation, the result was a buried world. You are allowed to believe both. I told you cities sealed their lower floors. I gave you Chicago, where they lifted the buildings. Now I want to give you Seattle, where they did the opposite, and where you can walk through the buried floor today and touch the windows. In June of 1889, a fire. It started with an overturned glue pot in a carpentry shop. That is the documented cause. Burned 25 city blocks of downtown Seattle to the ground. No one died, and when the city rebuilt, the engineers made a decision. Pioneer Square had been built on filled-in tideland, and it flooded constantly. The sewers backed up at every high tide. The streets were a swamp, so they regraded. They raised the streets. generally 12 feet higher than before, and in some places nearly 30 feet, by building retaining walls along the edges and filling in behind them with rubble and dirt. But the merchants had already started rebuilding their shops at the old level fast because they had a living to make. So, when the new streets went up a full story higher, the original ground floors of those buildings were suddenly below the street. The front doors opened onto a wall of fill, and for almost 20 years, people kept using them anyway. They climbed down ladders from the new sidewalks into the old storefronts, and they put little glass skylights, vault lights, into the new sidewalks to let daylight down into the buried floor, and they shopped down there underground in the city that used to be at street level. In 1907, the city condemned it. They feared bubonic plague in the buried passages, and they closed the Seattle Underground, and they sealed it, and it sat in the dark. It is still there. You can take a tour of it right now. You can walk through the buried first floors of an American city, past the storefronts and the brick arches and the old windows that used to look out on a street and now look out on packed earth. Exactly. Exactly what Patrick Develin described putting his lamp through in a Vanderbilt cellar in 1912. The Seattle Underground is not a theory, it is a ticketed attraction. The buried windows are real, and you can put your own hand on them. So, when Develin writes that he found a lower floor with windows that once looked on open air, now sealed under fill, with a swept floor in the dark behind them, he is describing something that demonstrably exists. We have one you can visit. The only difference is that in Seattle, they tell you about it. And under the Vanderbilt mansion, somebody paid a stonemason extra to make sure you never would. Let me lay them out for you in a row, the documented cases, so you can see the shape of the thing, because one buried floor is an accident, two is a coincidence, but this is a pattern, and the pattern is in the public record. Chicago, beginning 1856, completed through the 1860s. Streets and buildings raised 1 to 2 stories to install drainage. Result: original ground floors became basements across the central city. Engineer of record, Ellis Chesbrough, documented, dated, undisputed. Seattle, after the fire of 1889 and through the regrade that followed. Streets raised 12 to 30 feet. Original storefronts sealed underground, used until 1907, condemned, and still standing below the modern sidewalks. The Seattle Underground, documented, dated, and open to the public. Sacramento, California, I will give you a third, because people think it was only those two. After catastrophic flooding in the 1860s and 1870s, the city of Sacramento raised its streets, in places more than 10 feet, and the old ground floors of the business district became basements there as well. There is a Sacramento Underground too, beneath Old Sacramento, with the original sidewalks and shop fronts buried below the raised grade. Documented, dated Atlanta. The downtown there grew up over its own original street level as the railroad viaducts were built higher and higher across the tracks, until the old ground floors were left in shadow below the new streets. They sealed for decades and reopened as Underground Atlanta. The original storefronts are down there still. 4 cities, 4 buried street levels, 4 times that a town in America climbed up out of its own foundation and left its first floor in the dark, with windows looking out at packed earth. And in every single case, there is a reason on the record. Flood, fire, cholera, drainage, the railroad. Good reasons. Engineering reasons. I am not disputing one of them, but look at the result. Strip the reasons away, and look only at what was left behind. The bare physical fact in the ground. A buried lower world under a modern city. A floor below the floor. Windows that look out on nothing. That is not folklore. That is the survey record of the United States in the 19th century. And it means that when a stonemason says he found a buried floor under a Gilded Age mansion with windows sealed under fill, He is not describing a fantasy. He is describing the single most common large-scale anomaly in American urban history. The only thing unusual about his account is that someone made him hide it instead of selling tickets to it. The pattern is real. The burying is real. The only question Devlin leaves us with is how old the floor under the Vanderbilt house really was, and whether, this time, the family raised the ground over something they had not built and did not understand. So let me be exact with you now, because I have asked you to come a long way down into the dark with me, and I owe you the truth about where the floor of the evidence is and where the speculation begins. I am not telling you that a buried civilization sits under New York. I want to say that as plainly as a man can say anything. I am not telling you there is a lost empire under Fifth Avenue, that there were giants or gods or a vanished race of master builders living in the lower world. I have no floor of evidence for that, neither does anyone. Anyone who tells you they do is selling you something, and I would rather lose you tonight than lie to keep you. Here is what I am telling you, exactly this, and no more and no less. I am telling you that American cities, by their own documented engineering records, raised their streets by entire stories and buried their original ground floors, and that those buried floors, with their sealed windows and their dark rooms, physically exist today, and that in Seattle you can buy a ticket and walk through one. I am telling you that the Vanderbilts built mansions with deliberately hidden, sealed sublevels, and that this too is in the official documented record of those houses. And I am telling you that a stonemason named Patrick Develin, a poor and careful and honest man with no reason to lie, and every reason to stay silent, wrote in a letter to his son that he was paid extra to brick up a lower floor under a Vanderbilt house. A floor with a relieving arch in an old proportion that did not match the mansion above it, that he drew from memory, true, and folded away for 40 years. Those three things are what I have. Two of them you can verify yourself by sundown. The third is one man's testimony, preserved in his own hand, consistent in every structural detail with the two you can verify. What you do with them is yours, but here is what I will not do. I will not pretend the floor below. The floor is a fantasy when the city of Seattle charges admission to one. I will not pretend the burying of old ground levels is a conspiracy theory when it is in the published memoirs of the engineers who did it. The strange part is not that buildings got buried. That is settled history. The strange part is how thoroughly we have agreed to forget it. How a thing that happened in plain daylight, with jack screws and retaining walls and hundreds of workmen in city after city, somehow fell out of the story we tell about ourselves until it sounds like madness to even mention it. It is not madness, it is masonry. The ground you stand on is younger than you think. In a great many places, it is not the bottom. There is a floor below it, and the floor was somebody's street, and the street had windows that looked out at the sky, and one day the sky was taken away. Devlin took it away from one of them with his own hands, and it broke him for 40 years, and then he wrote it down. I want to end by defending him. Patrick Develin did a thing he was ashamed of. He bricked up a doorway he should have left open. He took money to do it. He knew, the whole time, that he was wrong, and he did it anyway, because he was poor, and he had a son, and the family's man stood behind him in a good coat, with a voice that did not need to be raised. You could call that cowardice. I do not. Because Devlin is the only one of the 5 men who went down into that cellar who did the one thing that mattered. He remembered. He drew the arch true. He kept the drawing for 40 years. And when he was dying, when the money no longer meant anything, and the family's man was long in the ground, and there was nothing left to be afraid of, he picked up a pencil with a hand that could barely hold it, and he told. He sealed the door. But he could not seal his own mouth, not forever. He left a crack. He left it for his son, and his son's wall kept it for 43 years, and a stranger tearing out lath in Queens brought it back into the air. That is not how an empire is supposed to work. An empire seals the floor and pays the mason, and the mason stays bought. That is the whole arrangement. It worked on four of them. It worked on the contractor. It worked for the most part on history itself. It did not work on Patrick Develin. And it is not working now, because you are standing here in the cellar with me, holding his lamp, looking at the arch he drew. They buried the floor, they raised the ground, they paid for the silence, and they got it, mostly, for 100 years. But the archive was never destroyed, it was only buried. And the thing about a buried floor, the one thing the family's man in the good coat never understood, the thing that should keep men like him awake, is that it is still down there. Sealed is not gone, bricked is not erased. Every wall Develin laid is still standing in the dark exactly where he left it, waiting, the way the Seattle Underground waited from 1907 until somebody opened a door and sold a ticket. What is sealed can be opened. What is buried can be dug. That is the whole work. That is why I do this, and why I asked you to subscribe, and why I will keep going down into the dark as long as you keep coming with me. They count on us forgetting. They build the whole thing on it. And every time one of us refuses to forget, every time a dying mason picks up a pencil, every time a stranger pulls a tin box out of a wall, every time you watch one of these to the end instead of looking away, the burying fails a little. Keep digging with me, because there is another one. In the spring of 1897, on the open prairie of Nebraska, a railroad crew was boring a cutting through a low rise of ground to lay new track. They were nowhere, 50 miles from the nearest town, nothing around them but grass to the horizon. And 40 feet down into that rise, the boring auger stopped against something it could not cut. Something the foreman, when he climbed down to see it, could not at first understand was not a stone at all. It was the largest thing any of them had ever seen taken out of the earth, and like Develin's door, it was written down, and like Develin's door, it was buried again. I have the account. Next time we go to Nebraska, the archive was never destroyed. It was only buried.